The sun hung low over the endless plains, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and rose. Out here, the world seemed to stretch on forever, flat and unforgiving, as though the land itself demanded resilience of anyone who dared call it home. And Maren had dared. She stood on the small wooden porch of her homestead, hands calloused from work that never truly ended, eyes scanning the far distance where the hills met the sky. A frontier woman by choice, though not by birth. Back east, her life had been orderly, measured, bounded by the walls of civilization and the expectations of others. But here, out in the untamed West, order was an illusion, and the expectations were her own. Each day was a negotiation with the land, a silent agreement between her spirit and the dust under her boots. Maren had come west seeking something she could not yet name. Freedom, perhaps. Adventure, or the chance to prove herself in a world that did not care for delicate hands or faint hearts. She had traded the familiar comfort of hearth and town for the rawness of open skies, for nights where coyotes sang to the stars and the wind whispered secrets only those who listened could understand. And though the freedom thrilled her, it was accompanied by a weight she could not ignore: isolation. Every sunrise reminded her that the nearest neighbor was miles away, and with each passing day, the awareness of that distance settled in her bones like a quiet ache. Her gaze fell upon the faint silhouette of a rider in the distance. A neighbor, most likely, though the shadows made it impossible to tell. She waved, calling out, "Jacob? It's Maren. Over here." The figure slowed, approaching on a horse that seemed as steady and enduring as the land itself. Jacob tipped his hat as he came to a stop. "Maren," he said, voice low and cautious, "I didn't mean to startle you, but there's talk along the trail. Strange riders, banded together, moving through the northern passes. People are uneasy." Maren's brow furrowed. "Bandits?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. She had faced hardships before, but the thought of being unprepared, unprotected, stirred a tension she could not easily shake. Jacob shook his head. "Not sure. Comanche maybe. Could be raiders looking for trouble. Keep your doors locked tonight, Maren. The land is restless and restless men follow it." She nodded, forcing a small smile, though it felt fragile even to her own ears. "Thank you, Jacob. Oh, be careful." He tipped his hat again as if to punctuate the warning with finality, and rode off into the fading light. Maren watched him go, the distant dust cloud marking his passage, and her heart felt the pulse of unease beneath the rhythm of the wind. Maren turned back toward her home, a modest structure built with her own hands and the help of neighbors long since returned to their families. The door creaked as she stepped inside, the familiar smells of wood smoke and dried herbs grounding her, though they did little to quiet the whisper of worry that had begun to settle in her mind. Out here, danger could approach silently, carried on the wind or hidden in shadows that stretched longer with the setting sun. She moved about her home methodically, checking the locks, securing supplies, the motions comforting and yet hollow. Her thoughts wandered eastward to a life she had left behind, streets lined with cobblestones, the smell of freshly baked bread from corner bakeries, the distant tolling of church bells marking a predictable passage of time. Here none of that remained. Only the raw, untamed wilderness, the constant sun, and the looming awareness that at any moment, everything she had built could be swept away. And then, as the last light bled from the sky, Maren paused, looking out through the window at the endless plains. The wind carried with it a sense of urgency she could not yet name, a promise that her life on this quiet homestead was about to change forever. She could not yet see it, could not yet imagine the turn her path would take, but in the hush of twilight, with shadows deepening across the land, Maren felt the first stirrings of a story that would demand every ounce of courage she possessed. Tonight, she thought, as the sky darkened and stars began to prick the horizon with silver light, the land would test her. And she would learn, perhaps too late, that freedom and danger were always intertwined on the frontier. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, something moved, an inevitability that could not be ignored. And when it came, it would arrive not with a warning, but with the raw certainty of the plains themselves. Maren drew a deep breath, the taste of dust and smoke mingling with the sharp tang of fear. She tightened her grip on the edge of the table, on the life she had made for herself here, and whispered into the quiet as if speaking to the wind itself, "I am ready. I will endure. Whatever comes." And in that moment the plains seemed to shift as though listening. The stillness of the evening held a promise, a foreshadowing, and somewhere in the distant twilight, the first threads of danger began to weave themselves into her life. The frontier had always been harsh, but tonight it would teach her something far harsher. Something that would challenge every belief she had, every instinct she had relied upon. And Maren, unknowing, would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Night fell quickly over the plains, and with it came a darkness that seemed to press in on every corner of Maren's small homestead. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a prelude to the chaos about to descend. She had just begun lighting the lamps inside her cabin when the first sound reached her, hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth outside, sharp and relentless, carrying an urgency that made her blood run cold. At first she thought it was a trick of her imagination. Perhaps a neighbor riding late. But then came the shouts, rough, commanding voices that made her pulse quicken, voices that carried a threat she had never known up close. The lamps flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls as the noise drew closer, louder, impossible to ignore. Maren's heart hammered. She clutched the edge of the table, eyes darting to the doorway. And then the first torch appeared in the darkness, a swinging orange flame that illuminated the silhouettes of riders, mounted men moving like shadows over the crest of the hill. Her breath caught. This was no neighbor. This was not a chance passerby. Before she could react, the front door splintered, crashing inward under a forceful push. Her world erupted into chaos. Horses screaming, wood splintering, the cries of men shouting in a language she did not understand, and the sharp scent of smoke curling into her nostrils. Panic surged through her, hot and raw, as she realized she could not flee, could not hide. She stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of a chair, heart racing so fiercely it drowned out everything else. Hands grabbed her from behind, strong, unyielding but not cruel. She fought, she screamed, but the fear was paralyzing, the realization settling deep into her bones. This is the end. I will never see my home again. The animals, sensing danger, bolted, stamping hooves and neighing into the night, adding to the deafening chaos. Through the blur of motion, one figure stood out. A warrior with calm, measured movements, unlike the others whose actions were frantic and violent. He approached her with steady eyes that seemed to pierce through her terror, yet carried no immediate threat. For a fleeting moment, she caught her breath, disoriented by the contrast. Amidst the fury and destruction, this one man moved with purpose, not malice. Before she could process anything, she was lifted onto a horse, the ropes binding her wrists cutting into her skin. The ground slipped away beneath her as they galloped from her homestead, the firelight shrinking behind them, her home disappearing into the shadows of the night. She pressed herself against the horse, trying to make herself small, trying to deny the truth of her situation. But the reality was undeniable. She had been taken. The wind tore past her face as the sound of hooves and shouting filled her ears. The plains stretched endlessly around her, dark and unyielding. She dared not look back, afraid that if she did, the image of her home, her life, all she had known, would shatter her completely. Her mind spun, a frantic whirlwind of thoughts and fears. Who were these people? Why her? Would she ever see the rising sun over her fields again? Each jolt of the horse, each scream, each distant echo of gunfire pushed her closer to despair. The fear was suffocating, a living thing pressing in on all sides. And yet, even in the midst of terror, she noticed the quiet presence at her side. The warrior who had moved with her through the chaos, guiding, steadying, silently protective. Something about him made her hesitate in her panic, a flicker of curiosity amidst the terror. Even now, as the world seemed to collapse around her, a question whispered through her mind. Who was this man, and why did he move among the chaos with such control? But there was no time for answers. The night consumed her, and the plains stretched ahead, vast and dark. Maren's heart pounded, her spirit trembling under the weight of what had happened. She was no longer alone in her homestead. She was no longer in control. She was a captive now, carried into a world she did not understand, and the enormity of it pressed down on her like the desert sun at noon, fierce, inescapable, and unrelenting. The night seemed endless as they rode. Maren pressed herself against the horse, the ropes cutting into her wrists, the cold wind stinging her face, and the shadowed plains stretching in every direction. Every sound, the distant cries of animals, the echo of hooves, was amplified, every movement of the riders a reminder that her life had been irrevocably altered. Through the blur of motion, she became aware of him, the warrior who had moved with her through the chaos. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and silent, his movements precise and deliberate. In the midst of the raiders' shouts and the pounding of hooves, he seemed to carry a calm that defied the storm around them. His eyes, dark and steady, occasionally met hers, though they betrayed no judgment, no cruelty. Just awareness. When the riders finally slowed at the edge of a small clearing, the chaos gave way to a hush. The torches flickered against the shadows of the trees, casting fleeting light across the warriors' faces. Maren's heart pounded, each beat a drum in her chest as she was led off the horse and onto the ground that seemed suddenly alien beneath her feet. And then she saw him close. Tawa. He stepped forward, separate from the others, and knelt slightly, his dark eyes holding hers in a steady, unyielding gaze. He did not speak at first. He simply studied her as if measuring not her fear but her worth. "You are hurt?" he asked finally, his voice low, calm, and deliberate. Maren's lips trembled. "No, not really," she stammered, though her hands shook from adrenaline and terror. She glanced at the others, at the firelight flickering on their painted faces, but Tawa's presence seemed to cut through the chaos. Where the others were forceful, he was careful. Where they carried destruction, he carried restraint. He offered her water from a small hide pouch, an unexpected gesture that made her falter. Her mind raced. Was this kindness? Was it a trick? Why are you helping me?" she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. Tawa's eyes softened slightly, though the lines of his face remained stern. "Because," he said, "you are not theirs to harm." The weight of the word struck her, though she did not yet understand the meaning. Not theirs to harm. It was almost incomprehensible, this calm assertion of protection in a night defined by violence. Her chest tightened. She had expected cruelty. She had expected fear, pain, and the certainty of death. And yet here, in the heart of the storm, was something entirely different. Respect. Restraint. The faintest flicker of understanding. He helped loosen the ropes around her wrists, careful not to pull too hard. Each movement was deliberate, precise, and strangely gentle. Maren's heart thudded in her chest, not with relief, not entirely, but with a new, fragile curiosity. Who was this man who moved through chaos without it touching him? Who treated her not as a captive but as something more? "You will come with me," Tawa said, his voice soft but firm. "There is a place where you will be safe." She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but her voice failed her. Instead, she nodded, uncertainty and fear mingling with a strange, inexplicable sense of trust. There was something in him, something beyond words, that told her she would survive this night, and perhaps, in time, she would see more than just a captor. As he guided her toward the distant campfires, Maren stole a glance back at her burning homestead, the place she had called her own. A wave of grief washed over her, and yet, alongside it, a spark of something unexpected flickered, hope. Perhaps not the life she had imagined, but a life in which she might endure. And in the quiet strength of the man beside her, she sensed that endurance might not be lonely. The plains stretched ahead, dark and mysterious, carrying with them danger, uncertainty, and the promise of a story that had only just begun. And in the stillness of the night, beneath the vast, star-filled sky, Maren felt the first whisper of a realization she could not yet name, that in the heart of fear, protection, and perhaps something deeper, could exist. The plains stretched endlessly around them, a vast expanse of golden grass and shadowed valleys, as though the earth itself had no end. The sun burned high above, relentless and bright, forcing Maren to squint against its glare. Every step of the horse beneath her echoed in the silence between the windswept hills, a rhythm both hypnotic and terrifying. She had expected cruelty, a harsh hand and cold eyes. But Tawa moved beside her with a quiet vigilance that unsettled her in ways she could not name. Every so often he glanced at her, assessing, cautious, not judgmental, not commanding, simply aware. When the sun rose high and beat down on the backs of the horses, he shifted her cloak, draping it across her shoulders to shield her from the heat. When dust kicked up from the dry soil, he leaned close and offered her water, his hand steady, his touch careful. Each small act of care confused her more than it comforted. She had been told to fear him, to fear them, all of them. And yet here he was, moving through the plains with the patience of the wind, protecting her, guiding her, ensuring that the dangers of the open land did not touch her. Her thoughts raced, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and disbelief. Why is he helping me? What does he see in me? The questions pressed at her chest, sharp and insistent. Finally, unable to contain herself, she whispered, her voice trembling against the wind, "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her then, not with anger, not with impatience, but with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided his path. "Because no harm will come to you under my watch," he said simply, his voice low, deliberate, and steady. The words struck her, strange and impossible in their simplicity. They carried no hidden threats, no conditions, just a promise. For a moment, Maren felt something she had not allowed herself in days, a flicker of trust. Her fear did not vanish, not entirely, but it began to shift, softened by the quiet constancy of his presence. The plains rolled on, the colors of sunset bleeding into the horizon, gold fading to amber, amber to violet. She noticed the way Tawa moved his horse to shield her from the wind, how he positioned himself between her and the harsh glare of the sun. In every gesture, there was a careful attention, a mindfulness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the raid that had stolen her from home. Her heart, still clutched by fear, began to relax in tiny increments, a cautious curiosity blossoming where terror had once lived. She wondered who this man was, why he protected her, and what world he came from, so different from her own, yet somehow intertwined with her fate. As the sun dipped below the distant hills, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Maren dared a glance at him. His profile was calm, unyielding, yet there was a softness in the set of his shoulders, in the steady patience of his movements. She realized, with a slow and frightening clarity, that she had begun to see him not as a captor, but as a protector. And in the vastness of the plains, beneath the endless sky, a fragile thread began to form between them, a thread woven not of words but of gestures, of trust earned slowly, silently, across the miles of open land. The journey was far from over. Dangers still waited in the shadows of the plains, and the world beyond these rolling hills remained unknown. But for the first time since the raid, Maren felt a spark of something she had thought impossible amid the fear and the chaos, a sense that she might endure, that she might survive, and that perhaps she might even begin to understand the man who rode beside her, quiet and unyielding, his eyes fixed on the horizon yet never leaving her side. Night fell like a velvet blanket over the plains, and Maren felt the weight of it pressing in, a darkness so deep it swallowed the edges of her fear. The campfires flickered against the night, casting long shadows that danced across the faces of the warriors gathered around. She stood apart, a small figure on the outskirts, her hands still trembling from the ride, her mind racing with questions she had no words for. At first, everything terrified her, the quiet strength in the warriors' eyes, the way they moved with purpose, the unspoken language that threaded between them. Every gesture, every glance, seemed charged with meaning she could not yet decipher. She had expected brutality, domination, the cold indifference of captors. And yet, what she found was something entirely different. Tawa approached her quietly, his presence grounding in a way that made the chaos of the day recede. He knelt beside her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Move like the wind," he said. "Step softly. Respect the land. Listen before you speak. You will survive here if you understand the rhythm of this place." Maren watched him, hesitant. Every word felt like a map to a world she had never known, a world that had seemed impossible from the safety of her homestead. Yet in his calm, deliberate manner, she sensed a truth she could not yet name. This was not cruelty. This was care. Protection. Guidance. Around her, the camp moved with quiet efficiency. Warriors tended to their horses, their hands practiced and sure. Smoke from cooking fires curled into the night, carrying the scent of roasting meat and sweet grasses. Children laughed softly in the shadows, their play echoing against the hills. Women moved with a steady rhythm, weaving, grinding, preparing for the days ahead. Maren realized she was watching not chaos, but a delicate order, a harmony she had never expected in what she had feared would be a den of danger. Every movement carried dignity, every life carried meaning. She felt her chest tighten, not with fear but with awe. Tawa moved beside her again, guiding her hands as he showed her how to approach the fire without startling the others, how to step lightly on the dry grass, how to carry herself in a way that drew no attention but still honored the life around her. "Do not rush," he whispered. "Patience is strength. Quiet is protection. Understanding is survival." Her heart beat fast but in a different rhythm now. It was curiosity mingled with caution, wonder tempered by awareness. She watched him, the lines of his face calm and unyielding, his eyes alert yet soft. In the way he moved, she glimpsed a man shaped by this land, by its demands, its dangers and its truths. And she began, in fragments and half-understood moments, to feel the first flickers of trust. The night stretched on, deep and infinite. Maren's fear did not vanish, but it began to shift, softened by the realization that she was not invisible here, nor wholly at the mercy of strangers. She was being seen. Not as a captive. Not as property. But as a human being, fragile and trembling, yes, yet capable of learning, of understanding, of adapting. Tawa paused beside her, glancing toward the stars stretched wide across the sky. "The land speaks if you listen," he said softly. "Tonight, it whispers of patience. Tomorrow it will teach more." Maren nodded, though the words only partially made sense. She looked around again at the camp, the flickering fires, the quiet rituals, the laughter and the care, and for the first time since the raid she felt a fragile spark of something new. Respect. Understanding. And the faintest, most dangerous flicker of hope. As she settled at the edge of the fire, watching the warriors move, the women work, the children play, Maren realized that the world she had feared was not entirely what she had imagined. It was different. Fierce, yes. Foreign, yes. But also alive, whole, and strangely beautiful. And in the shadowed corner, where Tawa sat patiently, guiding her with quiet words and gentle hands, Maren began to understand that perhaps her survival here would not depend solely on luck or escape, but on learning to see the land, the people, and the man who had become her protector with new eyes. Morning broke over the plains, pale light spilling across the grass and rolling hills, painting the world in soft golds and gentle shadows. Maren breathed in the crisp air, the scent of dew and dry earth mingling with smoke from the night's fires. Her hands were steady now, not trembling as they had on the first night in the camp. Each small movement carried purpose, and with it, a growing sense of possibility. Tawa moved beside her, silent as the wind, guiding her steps without a word at first. He showed her how to read the tracks pressed into the soft soil, hoof marks from deer, the scuff of coyotes, the faint drag of a rabbit across the dust. At first, the markings were confusing, a chaotic jumble of shapes, of signs she could not yet interpret. But with Tawa's patient guidance, she began to see patterns, stories written in the earth by creatures that had walked these plains long before her. "Look here," he said softly, pointing with the tip of a finger. "The deer went this way. Slow, careful. See how the tracks change near the water? That is how you know where it drank, where it paused. Follow without disturbing." Maren nodded, her heart quickening with a mix of fear and excitement. She crouched low, following the prints, her eyes wide, her mind alert. Each step she took was deliberate, each breath measured. When she spotted the deer grazing in a distant clearing, something inside her shifted. She had done it. She had seen. She had understood. Tawa watched her from a few paces away, silent, yet every glance carried approval. He did not speak, he did not need to. She could feel it in the tilt of his head, the faint narrowing of his eyes and quiet pride. For the first time since the raid, Maren felt capable. Strong. Not just surviving, but learning, thriving, beginning to belong in a world that had once been nothing but fear. As she crouched, her hands steady, her movements careful, she allowed herself a small laugh when a rabbit darted across her path, startling her just enough to send a rush of adrenaline through her. Tawa's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles, a rare crack in his stoic demeanor, and Maren felt a warmth bloom in her chest. He was not mocking her. He was sharing this moment, silently celebrating her progress, her courage. "Good," he said at last, voice low and calm. "You see. You learn. You listen. That is how you survive." She looked at him then, a question forming on her lips, and he only nodded once, steady and unshakable, before turning his attention back to the land. The silence between them was not empty. It was a language she was beginning to understand, a language of trust, of shared moments, of quiet acknowledgement. Maren's confidence grew with every step. She began to move with purpose, noticing the way the wind carried scents, how the sun shifted shadows across the ground, how the earth whispered secrets to those who cared to see. She tracked the deer, matched its careful steps, and when she finally stood, watching it vanish into the distant brush, Tawa's nod of approval struck her more deeply than words ever could. In that moment, the terror that had once consumed her felt distant, like a shadow fading in the rising light. She was still far from home, still far from everything she had known, but she was no longer powerless. Every small victory, every lesson learned at Tawa's patient side, built a bridge between fear and trust, between isolation and belonging. And as they moved back toward the camp, side by side, she realized the bond between them was no longer fragile or hesitant. It had begun to root itself quietly, deeply, in the soil of shared understanding, in the rhythm of the plains, in the unspoken care of a man who had seen her not as a captive, but as a person worth protecting. For the first time, Maren felt the stirrings of something dangerous yet undeniable, the sense that she could trust him, that she might even come to care. And as the morning sun warmed her back, she let herself imagine that perhaps she was not entirely alone in this vast, unforgiving land. The plains that had once felt vast and open now seemed smaller, claustrophobic, every ridge and hollow carrying the weight of unseen eyes. Morning mist clung to the grass, hiding shapes, shadows, possibilities. Maren felt it first as a tightening in her chest, a prickle of unease she could not ignore. Smoke curled on the horizon, thin and black but unmistakable. The telltale sign of others moving, of eyes that sought to hunt, to challenge, to take. Her pulse quickened, not with panic this time but with clarity. Danger was never far. It had never truly left. And yet she was not helpless. She was learning. She was watching. She was surviving. Tawa moved beside her, silent, deliberate, a steady presence that anchored her fears. Every motion he made was precise, calculated. His gaze swept the land, reading the hills and the wind as though they were open books. He turned briefly toward her, his eyes calm, unwavering. "We move now," he said. "Stay close." Maren's lips parted and a tremor crept into her voice. I trust you," she whispered. The words surprised her, a fragile confession carried on the wind. But Tawa did not flinch. He did not mock or question. He merely nodded once, a small gesture heavy with unspoken understanding. In that nod was reassurance, protection, and a promise that she did not yet have the words to define. They moved as one, the rhythm of their steps careful and deliberate. Each hill they crossed, each ridge they crested, heightened Maren's awareness. Her heart, once weighed with fear, now thumped in tandem with Tawa's steady stride. She saw the land differently, the way shadows stretched and folded, how the wind carried scents, how distant shapes could be threats or illusions. Every detail mattered, and for the first time she felt capable of noticing them. As the smoke drew closer, she realized that survival was never solitary. It was trust and skill and shared vigilance. And in that moment she understood the depth of her dependence on Tawa. Not as a captive relying on her captor, but as someone learning to navigate a world too vast and dangerous to face alone. A figure appeared first on the ridge, a scout, barely visible, moving with a hunter's precision. Maren's breath caught. Tawa's hand rested lightly on her back, guiding, steadying. His presence was a shield, unspoken yet undeniable. He did not rush her, did not demand courage. He simply walked beside her, and through that silent partnership, courage bloomed within her. "They are close," he murmured, voice low, almost a shadow in the morning air. "We do not flee. We observe. We wait. And we act only when necessary." Maren nodded, the words grounding her, reminding her that she was not at the mercy of fear alone. Every skill she had learned, the patient tracking, the quiet observation, the rhythm of the land, now mattered. And more than that, the presence of Tawa beside her gave her the confidence to act, to think, to survive. They watched together, breathing shallowly, moving almost as one with the plains. And in the silence between heartbeats, Maren felt it, something that had begun quietly in the campfires of the night before, something that was stronger now, forged in the crucible of shared danger. Trust, yes, but more than that. A bond tempered by adversity, shaped by patience, and strengthened by the realization that here, with Tawa, she could face what the world threw at her and still stand. As the smoke grew closer, as distant voices carried over the wind, Maren's fear no longer ruled her. She was alert, aware, capable. And with Tawa beside her, guiding, guarding, unwavering, she understood for the first time what it meant to truly rely on someone, and to allow that reliance to change her in ways she could not yet name. Night fell over the plains like a velvet curtain, the stars spilling across the sky in endless silver ribbons. Maren sat near the fire, the glow flickering across her face, highlighting the traces of the day, the dust in her hair, the fatigue in her limbs, the tension that had settled in her chest. She thought of the day's journey, of the smoke on the horizon, the silent tracking, the quiet guidance of Tawa. Her mind wandered back to the moment she had first seen him in the raid, stoic, unyielding, a figure who had once filled her with fear. She had expected cruelty, brutality, maybe even hatred. She had steeled herself for the worst. And yet here he was. Silent, watchful, protective, his presence more commanding than any weapon, more grounding than any word. Maren's fingers brushed against the earth, tracing the lines of the soil as though seeking some answer in its quiet permanence. "I thought I would hate you," she admitted softly, the words almost swallowed by the crackling fire. "I thought I would despise everything you represented. Instead I feel safe." Tawa's gaze lifted from the fire, dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He did not respond immediately, allowing the weight of her words to settle, allowing her voice to carry across the space between them. Then in his calm, measured tone he spoke. "Your heart must learn the land as your eyes have. Only then will it understand." Maren turned slightly toward him, absorbing the gravity of his words. There was no pretense in his tone, no performance. It was truth delivered quietly, with patience and intent. Her heart, still learning, still cautious, began to loosen its grip on the fear that had bound it for so long. She realized in that moment that trust was not just about protection or skill. It was about presence, about seeing a person in their entirety, strength and silence, patience and resolve. Tawa had not demanded her understanding. He had shown it, day after day, through acts both small and profound. A quiet wind whispered through the camp, stirring the embers and carrying with it the scent of sage and earth. Maren drew her knees closer, feeling both the chill and the comfort of the fire, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself a sense of peace, not the peace of absence but the peace of presence, of knowing that someone beside her saw her fear, acknowledged it, and chose to stand with her anyway. She glanced at him, tentative, searching for a sign, any gesture that would confirm what her heart was beginning to understand. Tawa's hand rested lightly on his knee, still, unwavering, offering silent reassurance without expectation. In that simple act, Maren recognized something far greater than mere protection. She recognized respect, attentiveness, a steadfast patience that could bear witness to both fear and courage. And as the stars above stretched endlessly across the sky, as the fire flickered and shadows danced, Maren felt a subtle shift within herself. Fear still lingered as it must, but it no longer ruled her. She had glimpsed a man who could be trusted, who could teach, who could guide. And in that realization she found not just safety, but a fragile, nascent hope, a sense that perhaps, even in this harsh, untamed land she could belong. For the first time she allowed herself to believe that trust, like the land, could take root, grow and endure, even in the most unlikely of places, even between the most unlikely of hearts. The horizon shifted, a ripple of movement that made Maren's heart seize. Figures emerged from the tall grass, dark silhouettes against the dying light, their intent unmistakable. The threat was real. Immediate. Dangerous. Tawa's eyes narrowed, scanning the advancing shapes with the precision of a man who had read the land like an open book. There was no hesitation in his movements, no panic. Only focus, calm, and an unyielding determination to protect. And in that determination, Maren felt an anchor she hadn't known she needed. She crouched low behind a ridge, heart hammering, breath shallow. Fear still clung to her, cold and sharp, but it was tempered now by understanding. She had learned much in the weeks she had been here, the rhythm of the plains, the whispers of the wind, the subtle signs of approaching danger. She could see the attackers before they closed, sense their patterns, anticipate their movements. And she knew somehow that Tawa could not see everything. He could not guard her in every shadow. Her voice was a whisper, barely more than the rustle of grass, but precise. Over here, behind the ridge. The words carried across the distance, a lifeline in the chaos. Tawa's head snapped in her direction, eyes locking with hers for a moment that felt stretched across eternity. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. She was no longer merely a passenger in this world. She was part of it, part of him, part of the struggle for survival. Then he moved, swift, silent, unerring. Each step measured, each strike deliberate. He disarmed one attacker with a twist of the wrist, turned another's momentum against him, all with a fluidity that spoke of countless battles fought in shadows. And through it all he kept one thought foremost: keep her safe. Maren's pulse raced, a chaotic counterpoint to his controlled precision. She spotted a threat Tawa could not see from his vantage point, and instinctively raised her voice again. Behind you. Left flank. His eyes flicked in the direction she indicated. A nod, a subtle shift, and the danger passed. No words, no thanks, just the unspoken bond of lives intertwined in survival. The attackers faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks. Tawa pressed forward, cutting through the chaos with a calm ferocity that left Maren awestruck. Every motion, every decision, was guided by more than skill. It was guided by loyalty, by honor, by the promise he had silently made to her weeks before, that no harm would come to her under his watch. And in that moment, Maren understood the depth of the bond forming between them. It was forged not in words, not in fleeting gestures, but in life-and-death moments that demanded trust, courage, and unity. She had feared him once, thought him an enigma, perhaps even a threat. But now, as she watched him protect her, move with calm precision, and honor a silent vow, she felt a surge of something she had not expected: respect, admiration, and the first fragile stirrings of something far deeper. The enemy scattered, their threat diminished, but the tension did not fully leave the plains. Maren's legs shook as she stood, dusting herself off, realizing that her survival, and her trust, depended on this quiet, unwavering man beside her. Tawa returned to her side, his face calm, eyes scanning, hands steady. No words were necessary. They had survived together. And in the silent aftermath, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the plains, Maren felt the truth settle deep within her. Courage, loyalty, and trust were not just gifts. They were bonds forged in the crucible of shared danger. And now, more than ever, she knew she would follow him, not because she had to, but because she had chosen to. Dawn broke over the plains in gentle golds and pinks, painting the world in quiet light. Maren sat near the fire, the warmth a comfort against the chill of the morning, her mind still racing from the night's danger. She looked across the camp at Tawa, his silhouette calm and steady, the embodiment of the courage that had kept her alive, the loyalty that had carried her through fear. Her chest tightened as she realized she could not return to the life she had known, the safety of walls, the predictability of routine. That world no longer fit her. It could not contain the woman who had seen danger, survived it, and felt the stirrings of trust she had never known. I cannot go back the way I came, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of truth. Tawa's eyes met hers, steady, unwavering, full of unspoken understanding. Then walk forward, with me, he said simply, offering a hand, a promise, a path into the unknown together. Maren's fingers brushed his, tentative at first, then with the quiet certainty of someone who had found safety, guidance, and perhaps something more. The plains stretched before them, wide, untamed, but no longer lonely. Together they would face it. The days that followed were filled with a rhythm of trust and discovery. Maren learned the ways of the land, each step guided by Tawa's patient hand. She laughed quietly as he taught her to track, to move silently through the brush, to respect the wind and the soil beneath their feet. Small gestures grew meaningful, a brush of the hand, a steadying grip when the ground shifted, a shared smile in quiet triumph. The world that had once seemed hostile now felt intimate, alive with possibility. Narrator, she had feared a world she could not understand, yet here she found a home and perhaps, love. One evening, beneath the endless expanse of stars, their hands found each other, tentative yet certain, fingers intertwining in silent acknowledgement. A kiss followed, brief, tender, full of promise, sealing a bond forged through danger, trust, and shared courage. Maren realized that the man who had once been a protector had become her companion, her anchor, her heart's quiet companion in a land that demanded strength. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, spilling golden light across the plains. Maren and Tawa stood side by side, shoulders brushing, hands clasped, gazing at the world stretched out before them. A world both harsh and beautiful, dangerous and endlessly full of possibility. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and sage, and in that stillness, the lessons of the plains settled deep into Maren's soul. She had faced fear, survived peril, learned to trust, and in the process discovered something she had never expected. A connection that crossed boundaries, defied expectations, and endured. Narrator, in the harshness of the plains, in the quiet of the night, two hearts learned a truth the world had yet to understand. Love could cross any divide, if only one was brave enough to trust. They stood together as the sun rose higher, light spilling over the horizon, their silhouettes framed against the endless expanse. In that moment, the plains seemed less wild, less unforgiving. It was a place where courage had been tested, trust had been earned, and love, quiet, steadfast and real, had taken root. And as the wind whispered through the grass, carrying the memory of fear and the promise of hope, Maren and Tawa stepped forward together, into a world that would never again be the same.